So you probably noticed when we talked about Asia last time that I left out China and Japan, two of the most important nations in Asia. But today we're going to talk about those as 6.5 and 6.6 because they're so important to the upcoming units that they kind of deserve just their own units focusing on them. So we're going to start with China and its relations with the West all the way from 1800 to 1914. So there's a lot of vocabulary for this one. The first one is balance of trade. This is the difference between how much a country imports and exports. So how much money are they spending on things from other countries, and how much money are they getting from selling things? A trade surplus is when you sell more things from your country than you buy from other countries. A trade deficit is where your country buys more things from other nations than you sell to them. An indemnity is going to be a payment for a loss in a war. So if a nation loses a war and another nation makes them pay for it, then that's an indemnity. An extraterritoriality, finally, is where foreigners in a nation they only have to follow their laws from their country. So this is like if a British citizen was living in India, they didn't have to follow India's laws, they followed British laws. So before the Europeans really come to control China, China had always very strictly controlled its trade. It was very isolationist and tried to keep other people out of it, so they had control. And China always had a trade surplus with Europe originally. The Chinese had things the Europeans wanted, but the Europeans didn't have a lot of things the Chinese wanted. So China was making a ton of money off Europe, and the Europeans obviously don't like that. The Industrial Revolution comes along, though, and it begins to flip that balance of trade. Suddenly, the Europeans start to have things that the Chinese want, and the Europeans have a lot of them. Also, Western military power begins to increase, and China's military power begins to decrease, and the balance that China could actually fight off the Europeans begins to tip towards the Europeans. And the Chinese Empire simply entered a time of decline. If you remember all the way back to 6.1, the dynasty, the Qing dynasty, who ruled over China, was having a lot of issues. Europeans are going to see an opening, and they're obviously going to take it. So if you think back to the last slide, remember China originally made more money off the Europeans than the Europeans made off of China, and the Europeans don't like this. But the British, after taking India, find out that the Chinese really like opium, and opium is effectively drugs. And the British find out that it's very easy to sell opium illegally to the Chinese and make a bunch of money. That leads to the Opium War because the Chinese don't want to lose all their money to their people buying drugs, so the Chinese government outlaws the opium trade. The British claim that the Chinese are interfering with their ability to sell opium because opium is illegal in India. And the British bring in their military, and this is the first time the Europeans really defeat the Chinese. This shows the technology between the Europeans and the Chinese is now way out of balance. The Europeans have a lot better military technology. The British win the Opium War, and this is going to be absolutely devastating to the Chinese. This leads to China having to sign a bunch of unequal treaties. So this treaty is called the Treaty of Nanjing. And the first thing that the Chinese have to do is they have to pay an indemnity to Britain. So because Britain beat them, the Chinese have to pay the British money. The British also take away Hong Kong and 5 ports to use to trade with the Chinese. So they're no longer Chinese ports, they're British. British citizens get extraterritoriality. So if a British citizen breaks a Chinese law that isn't also a British law, that citizen effectively didn't break a law. And Britain gets what's called the most favored nation clause. So if China makes a trade deal with the United States, Britain also gets that trade deal. So winning this war is a huge, huge thing for Britain because they just made a ton of money effectively off China. What this starts is a lot of nations see that China cannot resist them anymore. A lot of the Western nations are overly powerful, and they make China sign unequal treaties with them. So the Opium War kind of opens up a whole lot of issues within China also. The ruling dynasty, the Qing dynasty, was slowly collapsing in China. It had a lot of problems. The population had also exploded because of those medical advances that had been brought in by a lot of the Europeans. So we have a huge population. China just lost a war and their government's very weak. That kind of automatically means there's going to be a rebellion. And that leads to what's called the Taiping Rebellion. The Taiping Rebellion is actually possibly the third largest war in history after World War II, World War I. Nobody knows how many Chinese die, but it is absolutely millions. So a prophet led a rebellion based on his idea that China needed to reform itself. The interesting thing was this prophet basically started his own cult based on Jesus talking to him, but the peasants really like him because he wants to reform society and give land to the peasants and give power to the peasants as opposed to the upper class of the Qing dynasty. The Qing end up defeating the rebellion, but it leaves 20 million dead and it almost totally collapsed the Qing dynasty. The Qing dynasty had to make treaties with different warlords and use them to defeat the Taiping Rebellion, and that led to the Qing dynasty looking weaker and weaker. And again, Europeans used the rebellion to take more of China because the Qing are now fighting the Taiping Rebellion. They're not paying attention to what the Europeans are doing. So the Europeans offer the Qing money in exchange for ports. Sometimes they just straight up take places. And we're especially going to see the Japanese see this as an option to begin taking pieces of China. So Japan does the exact opposite of China, and they modernize rapidly and very quickly. If you look in the top right-hand corner, this is the Japanese army, and you can see they look like a modern European army. They pretty much adopt what the Europeans do and turn it into a Japanese style. So what breaks out is the Sino-Japanese War. So Sino means Chinese. So the Chinese-Japanese War, this is the first of 2 or 3 Sino-Japanese wars that break out. And Japan absolutely destroys China, and they take away Korea and the island of Taiwan from China. They just take them and they become part of the Japanese Empire. Again, this reveals Chinese weaknesses. Western powers come in, they begin to seize territory, trading ports. The reason Western nations are so interested in China is they don't actually want the land, they want to sell things to the Chinese people. They want to make money. So the United States eventually gets involved and comes up with this idea called the open door policy, that Chinese trade is open to everyone equally. Everybody will have a sphere of influence in China. This is to allow all nations equal access to the Chinese markets to make money off China, and nobody has to fight over it. You can see here kind of the areas of China that became spheres of influence. So this area here is still China, but this is where the other nations kind of have their interests. The only area that actually gets taken is going to be up here in Manchuria. Russia seizes it, and eventually Japan will take that away from China. And obviously Japan took Taiwan down here and Korea here away from the Chinese. So this is not a good time for China. Their empire is slowly collapsing. And we'll see all the way up until about the 40s, China is kind of beaten up by the Western nations and Japan. China does try to reform during this time. You can see here a Chinese factory. You can see Chinese making their own artillery. But they're very divided on if they want to adopt Western ways or not. So Japan kind of went all in, adopted Western ways, and completely changed itself. But China wanted to do it from within. So the first thing they do is what's called the self-strengthening movement. And this is just modernization. They want to modernize their country so they can resist Western imperialism. They begin to import new technology because they see they have to have modern weapons. They begin to build their own railroads. But it's very, very limited because the emperors in the Qing dynasty didn't really support the self-strengthening movement. So it never really took off like it did when we learn about Japan, where the emperor actually supported the modernization. Their next step is under this guy. He decides that he wants to reform the empire, and he's the emperor, and he's very serious about it. He launches a ton of reforms. He makes new laws. He tries to turn China into a modern nation. But his conservative mother overthrew him. She doesn't want the reforms. She wants to stay solely Chinese. She overthrows him, puts him in prison, and she ends all the reforms. This is kind of like the last chance China had to modernize, and she ruins it. She is really not liked by the Chinese people even to this day because she kind of ruined their chances of reforming. So that Qing dynasty that had ruled China for a long time eventually totally begins to collapse. And the first sign of it is going to be the Boxer Rebellion. So the Boxer Rebellion is named after what foreigners actually thought the peasants were doing. They thought that they were practicing boxing, but they're actually practicing martial arts. And a lot of peasants want to drive out the foreign devils, the foreign influence. They want to get rid of the British. They want to get rid of the French. They want to get rid of the Americans, and they want to go back to just being Chinese. An unusual thing happens where all the Western powers and Japan unite, send troops to protect their citizens living in China. So obviously, the Western powers win. They put down the Boxer Rebellion, and again, they force concessions on China. China has to give up more ports. It has to give up more rights. It has to give up more land to the Western powers. So that kind of leads the Qing dynasty to be discredited. And this guy, Sun Yat-sen, he's a Chinese nationalist. He wants to build up a modern China. He wants China ruled by Chinese. And his idea is that the people need to have nationalism. They need to believe in being Chinese. They need to have democracy. And they need to have a strong economy. Eventually, in 1911, the last emperor of China is overthrown and the Chinese Republic is founded. So China no longer has an emperor. It's no longer a kingdom. It is a republic, kind of like the United States. That leads us up to basically World War I. And then in World War II, we'll see that China is obviously invaded by Japan and the rise of the communists. So these are the different troops that took place to put down the Boxer Rebellion. We have the British here, the Americans, French, Indian troops for Britain, the Germans. I believe this is the Germans, or the Austrians. Shoot, I messed that whole thing up. So now we're going to move on to the modernization of Japan. And Japan is the exact opposite of China. They really embrace modernization, and they create an empire that rivals some of even the great European empires of the time. So the Meiji Restoration, this is when Japan actually began to reform itself, and it's under the reign of Emperor Meiji. And Japan goes from basically using swords, shields, and horses to having some of the best planes in the world in just a few years. A diet is this is the Japanese version of Congress. A Zaibatsu is these very, very powerful families that actually help industrialize Japan, families like Toyota and Mitsubishi. And then star this one, a homogeneous society. This means a society where pretty much everybody is the same. So the United States is not homogeneous, it's heterogeneous. We have a bunch of different cultures, a bunch of different languages. Japan is homogeneous in that pretty much everybody is Japanese and speaks Japanese. So Japan was originally ruled by an emperor, but this guy, the shogun, really had power. He was the top military leader of the emperor. And Japan was isolated for 250 years. They didn't even let foreigners in. But what happens is a guy by the name of Matthew Perry from the United States sails into Tokyo Bay and demands that Japan begin trading with the United States. And he says, if you don't, I'm going to bombard Tokyo. I'm going to burn it to the ground. So Japan opens up to Western powers. And this really embarrasses Japan. They couldn't resist the United States, and they don't want that to happen again. So a lot of samurai end up overthrowing the shogun and put the emperor back in power. And the emperor is going to be the one to reform Japan and try and get Japan to not be embarrassed by Western powers again. This leads to the Meiji Restoration. So this guy here, Emperor Meiji, believes he needs to strengthen Japan against the West. You can see he's not dressed like a old-time typical Japanese emperor. He's dressed like a Western-style king. So he sends out people to study Western ways, everything from science to military tactics to industrialism, and bring it back to Japan. He creates a constitution that gives Japanese citizens rights. He creates a very strong central government where he is in charge. And every single man in Japan has to join the military. He knows that building up Japan's military is the key to keeping it independent and not allowing Europeans or the Americans to control it. So Japan undergoes rapid industrialization. Western industry is encouraged. They build miles and miles of railroads. They build modern ports, telegraph, and they do this all in about 40 years. The reason they do this so quick is the government would build a factory and then sell it to a wealthy family. And these wealthy families are names that you've heard like Mitsubishi and Kawasaki, and then they run the factory. So this allows the government to pick and choose where they want to industrialize and kind of focus their efforts. The social changes that happens, he ends the class distinctions. Everyone now is just Japanese. Modern schools are set up to teach modern engineering and modern warfare so the Japanese can now do these things themselves and not have to hire European experts. In Japan, women do gain some rights, but overall they're still going to be considered like second-class citizens. So the Meiji Restoration is a massive success. Because Japan was a homogeneous society, because everybody was Japanese, it was very easy to reform and get everybody on board because he made it where everybody wanted to do this for Japan. Eventually, it allows Meiji to revise the unfair treaties with the Western powers and begin to make Japan its own empire. So after the Meiji Restoration, Japan is now an industrialized nation. But as we learned with the Europeans, if you industrialize, you need resources. And Japan is an island and they don't have a lot of resources. So their solution is to go build their own imperial empire, go get their own colonies. So in that first Sino-Japanese War we talked about, Japan defeats China. It's really the first time they flex their muscles. They take control of a lot of trade ports, Korea, a little bit of Korea and Taiwan. In the Russo-Japanese War, Japan is the first Asian power to take on a European power, and Japan wins. And they absolutely destroy Russia. And they take Manchuria away from the Russians, and they take Korea. So Japan begins to try and modernize these areas because they want to get as much as they can out of Korea and Manchuria to fuel their industry. One of the things that Japan is actually looking for when they colonize is food. Japan doesn't have enough land to actually feed itself, so they use Manchuria and Korea to provide food for Japan. Japanese rule is very, very brutal, though, as we'll see when we get to World War II. And Korea and Manchuria, if you resist at all, they come through and they execute entire families because Japan's rule is not to be questioned. So I hope this makes sense of both China and Japan. And if you need any help, just let me know.